So my brothers and my sisters, as we embrace this urgency of creating the beloved community, now is the time to be love. Love means understanding redemptive goodwill toward all which seeks nothing in return. So be love by implementing the demands of justice to eliminate the school to prison pipeline that has so many black children entrapped. Be love by correcting voting policies that seek to suppress the votes of millions of black and brown people. Be love and implement the demands of justice by transforming a society that is disproportionately violent toward black lives, including black transgendered lives and indigenous lives. Be love and correct false narratives and economic policies that continue to divide and pit poor and working class black and white people against each other. Be love and implement demands of justice where systems and structures are deconstructed and lead the way of living in community that reimagines just, humane, equitable, and sustainable policies, practices, and behaviors. Love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them who hate you, and pray for them that despitefully use you and abuse you. Be love and do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with our God.
The future belongs to those who show up, to those who come together and continue the good work of building the beloved community. Over the past few years, we've witnessed an awakening, one filled with shock and anger, alongside fear, pain, and exhaustion. We've seen bold claims and commitments and new voices stepping up. Change is happening, but with change comes resistance. Ushering in a new way of living, one free from racial division, requires rigorous persistence, nonviolent persistence, a love-centered way of thinking, acting, speaking, and engaging that leads to individual and societal transformation. What better way to build the beloved community than by bringing people together over food and conversation? In partnership with Inclusive, formerly known as Civic Dinners, the King Center is inviting you to host a beloved community dinner and continue the work of bridging the racial divide. Are you in? Here's how to get involved. Sign up to host a beloved community dinner. You'll receive the host guide with the 3 big questions. You can invite your neighbors, peers, colleagues, family, and friends to join. And you can host at your home or at your favorite restaurant or online. Simply follow the host guide for an amazing conversation and experience the power of community. You'll walk away feeling refueled and inspired with new ideas, connections, and resources. In times of isolation and exhaustion, simply coming together in community can make all the difference. Together we can build the beloved community. Join us.
Welcome to each and every one of you to this Beloved Community Talks experience with the King Center on behalf of Dr. Bernice A. King, CEO of the King Center, who will join us later in this broadcast. I just extend to you greetings all over the world. This is a very special conversation. Why all the tension? The relationship between the Black and Jewish communities. Now, you may be asking really, why all the tension? And tension sometimes can seem like a word and a concept that's hard to overcome. But I want to highlight for you at the beginning of this conversation that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said in his letter from Birmingham jail, which I believe to be a seminal transformative writing and teaching on nonviolence, even how to respond to conflict and criticism. He said and alluded to the fact that there's nothing wrong with tension. He said, tension in its essence can cause us to have to talk, to have to work together, to have to overcome, to have to reach injustice together. And that's our goal here in this conversation, to get to the answers to these questions, but to do it in a way that encourages us to do the work of eradicating injustice and to join together to do that work and overcome tension in doing so. Tension happens, but what do we do with it? So when answering why all the tension, we want to examine the relationship between Black and Jewish communities. We want to talk about why this tension exists, because somebody told me they didn't even understand and know that there was tension. Well, there is. But if we take it and do something with it, if we say, let's work on it, let's get to it, let's dig into it, we can get to the place where we can get to justice together. Let's do that. Let's have this conversation. Now, before our first conversationalist comes on, I want to invite you to share this broadcast. Please share this broadcast. If you're watching it on YouTube, copy the link and share it on your social media channels. If you're watching it on Facebook, I want you to tag 5 people right now in the comments on Facebook and invite them to this conversation. If you're watching it on Twitter, please retweet on Twitter. Wherever you're viewing, if it's the King Center website, copy that link and share it. It is important that we have courageous conversations. And sometimes they might not look like what you expect them to. For instance, this conversation tonight is with all women. That's okay. Mrs. Coretta Scott King said, women, if the soul of the nation is to be saved, you must become its soul. And so we're very intentional. What we're doing here right now, we're going to have this conversation, then have a part 2 where we continue the discussion with some men who will come and share their insight as well. And there's a purpose for that. I believe everything it happens in these conversations in a way that people can catch the information and then say, what do I do with it? So right now, I want you to go ahead, if you're watching this, if you're able to tweet or post, and use the hashtags Courageous Conversations, BCT, Beloved Community Talks. And I want you to go ahead and type out, there's nothing wrong with tension. It just matters what we do with it. There's nothing wrong with tension. It matters. It just matters what we do with it. Type that out. Use the hashtags. We'll go in later today and tag and retweet what you share on our social media platforms. Thank you so much for watching. Our first guest in this very important conversation is, I hope the last name is not new to you. I hope, because she comes from a family that has joined with communities to do very critical work to get to justice, specifically in the Black community and the civil rights movement. And we'll talk more about that a bit when she comes on. But Professor Susanna Heschel is the Eli M. Black Distinguished Professor and Director Chair of the Jewish Studies Program at Dartmouth College. She's an author. She's a trailblazer. She's magnificent in her work and in her communication of how we can unite to get some very important work done to lift our global community. Now, I want you to share that too. This is a call up, not a call out. We want to take some time in these beloved community talks to call up. This isn't about calling out. So I want to bring on now Professor Susanna Heschel to join us in this first segment of the conversation. Welcome, Professor Heschel. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Listen, we were talking before we got started about the significance of this moment. So I want you to begin by sharing, given your family, and I'll you can share in your space about your father, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. If you haven't studied him, I want to encourage everybody just to study. Now, studying is key, Professor Heschel, to justice work. And so often we miss that part, but history helps us to understand where we need to go. So can you share for a moment about your father, about his work, about your work, and how you believe history is critical to getting to why this tension exists? What do we need to understand about the historic relationships between Black and Jewish people in justice work?
Yeah, I first of all, thank you for the question. So let me just say something first about my father. My father came from Europe. He was born in Warsaw, Poland in 1907. He lived through the Nazi years in Germany and was deported in 1938, managed to come to this country in March of 1940. And now, when my father was studying and writing his dissertation in Germany, there were German Christian theologians who said that the Old Testament is a Jewish book and should be thrown out of the Christian Bible. They said that Jesus was an Aryan, a German, and not a Jew. And with this background, they said that Hitler was Christ come again. Yeah. But he came to this country as a refugee. He lost his mother was murdered and three of his sisters. And I think it was extraordinary for my father to encounter Dr. King and to experience Dr. King's affirmation of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, Moses, and the prophets. I think if there's anything that my father felt more deeply as a balm for the soul, it was Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement and the way they lifted up the Bible. And with that Bible, our Bible, I think Dr. King healed our souls. 6 million Jews were murdered, and we felt devastated. And then he came and he lifted up the Bible. And that made Jews feel also proud of being a Jew, and gave us something that links us spiritually, soul to soul. Jews, Jewish people, Black people coming together. And I know that that's what my father felt about Dr. King, that their souls were in friendship. So, of course, alliances. But I think I really feel it's important for us to recognize that the Civil Rights Movement was a religious movement, not only a political movement, but the religious and the political in the Bible go together.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. And as a religious movement, it was inspiring. Dr. King lifted us up and said to us, showed us with his example, what it is to be a great human being, what we can aspire to, that a human being could be someone like Dr. King is something extraordinary. It's inspiring. It's exciting. It makes all of us feel that we are lifted up. We can be more, even more in our lives as human beings. Now, should I go on? I'd like to just say something else, which is...
Absolutely, Professor Herscher. And then if you could move into why history is important, because when we ask the question, why all the tension, we at the King Center believe history, and that's why it's so critical that we stop this attempt to erase history about injustice and racism and anti-Semitism and rights of different groups from our schools. Why is history important? As you have continued to share with us, go into that as well as we talk about the tension that exists between Black and Jewish communities today. What can history teach us?
So, first of all, I think it's important for us to understand what we mean by history. History is not just the past. Saija Hartman, who's a great professor at Columbia University, speaks about living in the present that was created by the past of enslavement. That is, what we live today is the future created by the past. We're in the future created by that past. We can't escape that past. We're living with the ramifications of the past, its echoes, it created us. And enslavement is the past that is living with us, that created our present. So that's our heritage. One question that we might ask, if we're interested in history, is why is racism so tenacious, so stubborn? Why don't we get rid of it? It's bad for us as a society. It's terrible for us, for all people. So in that case, why is it so stubborn, racism? And so I think we also have to think about What is it with racists that somehow makes them think it's a good thing? What gives them pleasure in being racist? What's their sadism? What's their bad thinking? And that, I think, is what's so important for us to think about in history, why that past is still with us and why it's so stubborn, and how are the ways in which we live today in what was created by that past. It's not over. History is not something that's over and done with. It's with us today. And if we want to understand ourselves, we have to understand that we are living with the future created by the past, as Saidiya Hartman says.
Wow. Now, Professor Heschel, I just want to say, when you said that, we're living in the future created by our past, and can you tell us who to attribute that quote to again?
Yes, her name is Professor Saidiya Hartman, Hartman. She's a professor at Columbia University, and she's written extensively on enslavement in the United States. And she's a great scholar. Yeah,
excellent. I just want us to share that across the bottom in our
one of her books is called
that people can see.
Scenes of Subjection. It's excellent work. I'll just mention something else. You know, racism is not something that gets, in a sense, goes from one era to another, but rather we might think about racism as a reservoir, just like we have a reservoir of water, and when we need it, we draw the water from the reservoir. Racism is also a reservoir in this country. It's a reservoir that's there, that can be activated in a greater way, in a lesser way, but it's there as a reservoir. And I would say the same is true of antisemitism. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's very loud, but it's a reservoir. And when people want to be whatever it is, angry, contemptuous, express disgust, whatever, there are those reservoirs of racism and antisemitism. They can turn on the tap on the water and it all comes pouring out. So it's not just a set of ideas and it doesn't just appear out of nothing. It's there, that reservoir. What are we going to do about it?
I think, Professor Heschel, never before has it been more evident than in what you're saying, that in a positive way and in a negative way, Dr. King's words ring true, that we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny, that in fact, anti-Black racism and hate and anti-Semitism are closely linked together. And often, instead of fighting to eradicate those, we find ourselves fighting each other instead of approaching the ideology that says both of our communities are inferior.
Yes, and we have to say that there's nothing that white supremacists want more than to have Black people and Jewish people angry at each other.
Right.
That makes their lives so pleasurable.
Easier.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, because then we're not trying to defeat this injustice, those triple evils that Dr. King talked about, where our energy could be channeled to get rid of racism, to eradicate poverty, to get rid of materialism. We find ourselves saying we're battling each other.
Exactly. So then we get distracted and we go trading anger back and forth between, and that isn't going to take us forward. That isn't what's going to work. I know that there are people today who do not believe in allies. Mm-hmm. I have some students, for example, who will say, no, it can't be an ally. You will never understand me and my experience and how I feel. Now, to some extent, okay, no one can understand another person. You could say that theoretically. On the other hand, where's the love? And don't we all want to love and be loved by another person?
Sure. I just want to interject there real quick that Dr. King, Bernice A. King, mentions often that we need to redefine what allyship means, because often it means I have a problem and you have to come help me. But racism and anti-Semitism, they're all of our problems. So we have to work together. So I think how you're framing ally matters because it's different than what we often hear. It's very important that we get these are things that are going to destroy humanity if we don't eradicate them. And racism just won't destroy Black people. It will take us all out of here because it's a descending spiral of violence.
Yes.
Anti-Semitism as well.
Yes, I completely agree. Maybe we should say something about Afro-pessimism. Because, in fact, I'm thinking of Frank Wilderson's book, Afro-Pessimism, and also a wonderful South African philosopher, Tendai Sidhole, who wrote a book called The Black Register. And it's a sense that it's as if white people do not think that Black people are alive. And murder, George Floyd, and so many others in the United States, and Tendai Sidhole talks about the Marikana massacre in South Africa, for example. What are they doing in murdering? Do they not realize that Black people are alive, human beings? And one could respond to that with complete pessimism and feel there is no hope. And what was so important about Dr. King was that he spoke of hope. He gave us hope. He insisted on hope. You can't be alive without hope. In some sense, I think he also was telling us that, Afro-pessimism, and I would say the same is true of Jews who feel that anti-Semitism is, from the beginning of time and it's going to last forever and there's nothing we can do about it. No. First of all, a religious person can never live in utter despair. To live in despair, to live without hope, you're not alive as a person. And to live without hope is to say that God is not present, that God is not with us, but God is with us. And so the question we might ask is, what is it about white supremacy that works to give us a feeling of such complete despair and pessimism? We have to resist that. And we have to realize that we mustn't allow ourselves to be subjected to what they want.
I want to frame Professor Heschel as we close our segment, because I've heard you say a few things that get to the heart of and answer the question of why all the tension. And I want us to list those things out so that people can learn from this talk, this conversation, and say, here are some action steps as we close out. I heard you talk about us not understanding that history framed our today. So we want you to, if you're taking notes, if you're really being attentive, write that down. The tension exists in part, number one, because we don't understand the power of history and how it influenced today. So if we study history, maybe it will get us to some of the answers as to why this tension exists. So that's one. Two, you talked about us not understanding the spiritual component of the movement. And that's something that Dr. Bernice A. King talks about a lot today, that people don't realize, or they want to negate, that work that was done then was rooted in an understanding that there's something bigger than us. And that maybe there's tension because we don't see there's something bigger than us. And the third thing you talked about is the understanding that we're trying to conquer white supremacy, not each other. And that's the third principle of nonviolence. Nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice, not people. So the tension is coming from those three things that we want to start with in this beloved community talks that you just shared. I just wanted to capture them so that people could hear it and it would help us move into the next segment. Thank you so much. You're coming back before we end the talk. I appreciate everything you shared. Thank you so much, Professor Heschel.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Listen, when we talk about tension, one of the things we have to realize, in addition to Dr. King saying that we will have tension, is that there's a reason for it. And if we can get to the heart of it, we can have tension that doesn't destroy us because we can work through it. I want to share with you, I've been reading as we prepare for our next guest for this Beloved Community Talks experience. I've been reading and listening to Mrs. Coretta Scott King for the past few weeks, this speech she gave at an event called Infinite MIT. in 1994. The title of her speech was "The Movement for Economic and Social Justice." And she said this about this idea of a melting pot. She says that Dr. King, she said he saw America not as a melting pot, but as a vibrant mosaic of people of all races, religions, and ethnic groups. We need not surrender our group identities, he felt. So that kind of deals with this notion from people that Dr. King wanted a colorblind society. That's not what he wanted. It's not what he meant when he said that he wanted his 4 children to not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. According to Mrs. King, he saw America not as a melting pot, but as a vibrant mosaic of people of all races, religions, and ethnic groups. We need not surrender our group identities, he felt. Instead, we can weave them into a cooperative and mutually supportive framework. Why all the tension? As we segue into Julie Katz joining us, I want to highlight for us, as Mrs. King did in this speech in 1994, that it may be that we don't understand. We didn't have to melt together. We could maintain our identities. But what we can do is weave our identities into a cooperative and mutually supportive framework. Thank you so much, Professor Heschel. Now we have our next guest, Julie Katz, who is the Associate Director of the American Jewish Committee Southeast Region. Her work every day is to jail communities, to get us to the place, specifically the Jewish community, where there is cooperation, and not just cooperation. What we believe at the King Center is that we can cooperate, we can collaborate, but we don't have to compromise on justice. And that's the work that Julie Katz is focused on every day. We want to welcome Julie Katz to join us for our next segment. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you, Dr. West. It's wonderful to be here.
What did you think about that last segment?
Wow, it was, I took a whole page of notes from the things that you said and that Dr. Heschel said, starting actually with before Dr. Heschel came on, when you said that the purpose of these conversations is calling in, not calling out, which is something I really try to live by. And, you know, hearing Dr. Heschel speak about the future created by the past, and also using the reservoir metaphor to describe how racism and how hatred kind of ebbs and flows and how we address it. I think using those types of metaphors is just so powerful.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to see your notes. I'm just a student. I love to get insight on what you got from that segment and from this whole experience. And it's just very important that we talk to each other, Julie. And I think social media may have created a space where we don't talk that often. I see people tweet and post things on social media concerning people who I know they have their phone numbers. Mm-hmm. So there's a space for people to learn how to have courageous conversations. So certainly thank you for joining us for this series within this one experience of courageous conversations. Julie, let me just start by mentioning a name that I know is controversial right now and getting your insight on how we work through this tension. Kyrie Irving, who posted a video or linked to a video that people believe to be anti-Semitic. And what happened after that is there was a barrage of calls for him to be removed from certain companies' promotions, to lose contracts. And, one of the questions that it raised is that there are often people who are racist against Black people, and the response isn't that adamant and passionate. I think it ties back to some of the things Professor Heschel shared, that we're battling a common enemy in white supremacy and in racism and discrimination, which racism includes bigotry and attempts to diminish the lives of various groups of people. And it's based on power. It's a power construct. I just want to highlight that. Sometimes when we say racism, Julie, people think it means just not liking Black folks. You could dislike me and not try to stop me from getting a loan with a low interest rate. I just have somebody who dislikes me. Racism means you try to impede my life or take my life. And so, well, how do we talk about that when we have someone who's in the public square like a Kyrie Irving, who made, if he knew that the link or the video contained that information, could he not be aware of the harm that it would cause our Jewish neighbors? Or how do we get to a conversation versus just saying, away with you, Kyrie? How do we do that overall?
Yeah. And, it goes back to not just the why, but the how. So, what we were all talking about earlier. So, I'll actually tell my own story that just unfolded over these past few weeks, which is that I had a few acquaintances post some things in support of Kyrie on Instagram. I believe not really understanding why the things he was promoting were anti-Semitic or were so harmful. And one of those folks reached out to me actually and said, hey, I actually community or any Jewish people. I've really only known one Jewish person in my life, and I would love to get together with you and learn more about the Jewish community and experience. And the other person who posted something in support of Kyrie, I had reached out to one of our mutual friends and I said, hey, do you think that this person might be open to a conversation? And our mutual friend connected us and he was very open. And we ended up getting together. It was 3 of these guys and me and a couple other Jewish folks. And we ended up just getting together and sharing about the Jewish experience, sharing about our own personal experiences. And in the process, learning also about their experiences as Black men, where their families came from, the history involved both within their own personal families and within their communities. And so it's just this really beautiful learning experience where we, again, going back to what you said at the very beginning, we were calling in, not calling out.
In and up.
Yes,
Sound like
in and up. And I can,
in and up.
Right.
Yeah.
I can confidently say we came in as acquaintances and walked out as friends. And I actually just went to church with one of the guys this past Sunday and experienced his worship service. We went out to lunch afterward to learn more about his story. So it was literally the starting point. See, talking about kind of how when something bad happens or something happens in this space that's at first creating some sort of tension, like you're talking about the tension, the good that can come out of it, the friendships,
absolutely,
pushing past it, it's beautiful. So to answer your original question about what can we do, it's having those conversations, but in an authentic way. So how can we teach the people around us to approach these conversations and help people that are perhaps making harmful comments not feel defensive, but feel like there's something to gain from trying to address it?
And there's a dual focus there. I wanted to share, Julie, that when I was 17, my public speaking teacher, who was actually the sister of one of the Commodores, so she actually assigned me Letter from Birmingham Jail and Night by Elie Wiesel in the same school. I was in the 11th grade and I read Night and I said, I'm absolutely devastated. And it was devastating to me. One, I never heard about the Holocaust as an 11th grade student. But what it also did for me is it showed me that suffering isn't relative to one group. And I think when we understand that and we see, okay, we are caught up. What can we do to encourage the type of response that you had, where you invited people in? And I wanted to highlight for people and just reiterate, because I know a lot of people push back and they say, no, I'm not going to be friends with or try to talk to people who have harmed me or done things to harm me in my community. This is where we decide what's our ultimate goal. And at the King Center, our vision is the beloved community where injustice ceases and love prevails. To get there, we sometimes have to venture into the tension, find out why it exists, and have some conversations with people we might not ordinarily have conversations with. How critical is that to your work?
So critical. The base of it. Absolutely. So to answer your question, I'm going to talk about 2 different things. The first being psychology and understanding how our brains function and how we respond to people and conversations. And the second is understanding how all of this kind of functions in our daily lives and specifically in our companies and organizations, because so much of the DEI work is happening in that space. But have we stopped to think about if we are satisfying the kind of or working with how our brains function to address this issue. So to go to the first part, talking about the psychology of it, we need to understand what people are going to be responsive to. And so much of our communication is body language. And so if we're trying to approach someone in person to have these conversations, which is the ideal, because social media and online communication, unfortunately, erodes the trust that we can automatically feel in an in-person situation, or if not automatically feel more than we would if we were just kind of behind this virtual wall. So what does our body language look like? What is the tone of our voice? Are we trying to just tell them that a comment they made is offensive, or are we trying to, like you said, understand the basis of that comment? So for instance, I actually was in a tour group with a woman a few weeks ago who made some harmful comments about the state of trying to address racism in our country. And I caught myself actually, because my first inclination was to say, you're wrong, or that's offensive, or that's harmful. And after I did that, I actually said, wait, let me take a step back and try to practice what I preach. And I started asking her questions to understand where she was coming from and why she might have had these types of beliefs. And I kind of got down to the crux of it and was able to understand from her point of view why she felt that way. And then, only then, could I actually take steps to introduce kind of this cognitive dissonance of helping her question. And so the second part of this, talking about how we can approach this in organizations, is thinking really hard about the types of trainings that we're doing. So there is research that shows that mandatory anti-discrimination training is actually, or can be, more harmful for minority communities, or perpetuate more harm or more resentment toward minority communities. And on the surface, you think, well, why could that be? But when you really think about it, and when you read the research, you see that it's because people don't like being told how to think. And sometimes these trainings can make them feel that that's what's happening. So there's a really great article by some researchers that I am blanking on the names of right now, but I want to give them credit. So let me actually pull it up really quickly. Their names are Frank Dobbin and Alexandra Kalev. And they do some great research on what is actually effective in organizations. And the things that they can come up with are engaging managers in solving the problem, exposing them to people from different groups, and encouraging social accountability for change. So basically what this can look like is having them in rooms of people who are different than them, which sounds so simple, but a lot of organizations aren't doing that. And then other things are having peers say, hey, I'm coming to this program or this training about the Black community, about the Asian community, about the Jewish community. Do you want to come with me? And that way they're saying, well, my peers are doing this, so maybe I should check it out too. And so really kind of taking advantage of this psychological principle of belonging and wanting to fit into the social landscape. So understanding, again, it's all going back to how our brains function and how can we as change makers utilize that information to create change.
So what I basically hear you saying is we get out what we put in. And a lot of the change we want to see, the transformation, the theme for King Holiday 2023 is cultivating a beloved community mindset. Excuse me, to transform unjust systems. It starts with that thinking. What would you say are the main ways we need to shift our thinking to address the tension we're experiencing?
Wow. That is a really good question. Excuse me. These conversations are tough because there is so much room for error and for people feeling like they are either going to offend someone or that they're kind of waiting for the other person to offend them. So how do we shift our thinking? First, we have to shift our action. So actually at the beginning of a few conversations I've had in the past few months about discrimination in different contexts, I've said, hey, I just want you to let you know, don't be afraid of offending me. Ask whatever you want. If it's phrased in a way that might offend others in the future, I'll let you know. But I really don't want you to feel that within this space. And then the second thing is understanding the ways that we are talking. So storytelling. We started the segment with me talking about an interaction I had, a story from these past few weeks. And that really helps people understand what can happen, what can be done, using metaphors, like the great metaphor that Susanna used about the reservoir, sometimes using statistics, but always making sure that they are paired with storytelling or metaphors. And also, the most important thing is asking the questions. So how do we change people's mindsets? We ask questions, not in a way to make them feel belittled or call them out, but just say, hey, like, tell me why you feel that way, or tell me about your past experiences that might have led to you forming this opinion. I'm genuinely curious because I also have a lot of experiences that have informed my opinion. So trying to relate to them on that level. And when you continue asking questions, you both learn, because oftentimes they're questions that they have never had to answer themselves.
Wow. Thank you so much, Julie. I want to, as I did with Professor Heschel, kind of summarize so people can write down and move with what we're sharing here. What I heard you share and what really resonated with me is what offense does. One of the scriptural texts that I've been trying to study and live more frequently over the past year is learn not to take offense. Because in taking it, it prevents me from being able to hear other people, learn from other people. If I'm perpetually offended, it's just hard for me to navigate tension. And I may want the tension to stay because I'm offended regularly. So when we talk about why all the tension and answering that question, one of the answers that I think you've highlighted is that we have to pay attention to how we're offended and when we're offended, and ask ourselves, does offense prevent us from having healthy relationships within our communities and with people from other groups? And how does that prevent us from creating the beloved community? The second thing I really want to highlight that you shared, and I'm so grateful to just be able to say this to back up what you shared, is putting in the work concerning the tension. You talked a lot about paying attention to how we navigate, how we investigate, how we engage each other on a regular basis, that we have to think about how do I approach this conversation. And what you shared about the two people who you had to based on who you are. Some other people might not feel like they have to. You had to go in and say, let me learn from this person and also let me share what I know. So I think all of those things get us to why all the tension. And the answer is we need to know each other better. Dr. King, in one of his quotes, highlighted, we don't really know each other. We don't talk to each other. And we also need to be willing to put in the work to address tension. And then we also have to be attentive to our level of offense, even at the comments that we go back and look now and we say, maybe I shouldn't have been offended by that. Mm-hmm. I thank you for sharing what you shared. I look forward to continuing the conversation with you in 2 segments. You'll be back. Thank you so much, Julie. Thank you for joining us,
Dr. West,
for this conversation. Julie Katz, Professor Susanna Heschel, both bringing up some very valuable points about the tension. And if you're still asking, you say, I don't witness any tension between Black and Jewish communities. What we're doing is highlighting some of the examples of where that tension exists, and then also answering the question, why all the tension? Why? And in answering the why, how can we get to the place where we say, let's work together to defeat this injustice without trying to defeat each other? We have some folks sharing across our social media platforms. Thank you for your comments. Someone just shared going to different community meetings and listening to people and sharing ideas and thoughts. It's very important. Very important that we put ourselves in spaces where we hear from people that we might not normally sit down and say, let me hear from this person. It's very critical that we not just be in a place where we say, I can't learn anything from this person. We can learn. We can be positioned to be teachers and students at the same time. Our next guest is April Baskin. April Baskin is the executive director of Joyous Justice. And she's a rising, I want to be sure I pronounce this correctly, Kohenet Hebrew priestess who will be ordained in summer 2023. She's a faith leader, a justice leader. And faith and justice, as Professor Heschel reminded us, often go hand in hand. Welcome, April Baskin. All the way from Senegal.
That is right. The westernmost point, the tip of the nose of the African continent.
Westernmost point. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a
Welcome.
pleasure to be here with you, Dr. West, and all of our distinguished panelists tonight.
We're grateful to have you with us, April. What are your thoughts on what you've heard so far?
Oh, goodness, I have many thoughts. So one I want to say is someone who spent 20 years existing as a Black Jewish woman and doing extensive work in my Black and Jewish communities on this subject. Overall, I've been incredibly proud and felt deeply aligned with what both Dr. Heschel and Ms. Katz shared this evening. So that was really affirming because, to be quite honest, I've been on a number of panels and I don't always agree necessarily with what's been said, but I have been quite pleased and I feel more enlightened now that I feel like they already championed and raised a number of the points that I was hoping to touch. And perhaps I can dive deeper with you on, or perhaps take a different course depending upon where your guidance and vision guides our conversation together.
Maybe. Are there any things you want to open with based on what they've shared? What are your things that you want to start? Okay.
Okay, so there's a couple different points. So what I would say is I would build upon what Dr. Heschel spoke about around the history of enslavement and how the past is the present. I would weave some of the threads that have come together. In my work with Joyous Justice and the work we do with executive leaders and social justice leaders, that I think is quite similar to the work that the King Center does, and is deeply aligned. All of Joyous Justice's work is deeply aligned with beloved community. So again, joy to be here. The way I talk about it in the context of my work is histories of harm, and that we need to account for histories of harm. And as Professor Lloyd DeGroux and a number of different scholars speak about, we haven't fully accounted for this. And it's not simply, so I want to add to what Dr. Heschel said around the past being in the present, and also specifically weave that together with the conversation about keeping our cool and not taking offense, right? And what I see with the different executives and leaders with whom I've worked who are deep in the trenches around this, as you might identify with, is at times it's not always possible to not take offense. All kinds of things get said at times, and yet the stakes are still high, right? So to your core question, right, around, or your core statement, and then also shifting it into a question, right, that I love. I mean, I'm going to be quoting you now consistently because it so aligns with my work around. There is nothing wrong with tension. It just matters what we do with it, right? And for me, everything that I'm about to share distills down to rigor and compassion. And that's what we talk about in our context of the work within Joyous Justice, is how do we engage in love in the sense that both the Reverend Dr. King spoke about, and also the Vietnamese, both late luminaries, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, as well as the late monk Thich Nhat Hanh, spoke about love in the sense of it's not just a feeling that we have or a feeling that we project onto other people, but what's key to actual love is understanding the other. And what makes understanding the other in the context of Black-Jewish relations complicated is in part histories of harm that to this day largely remains unhealed, right? Because when we're existing in a context in which there has not been a truth and reconciliation process in this country, and there has not been reparations, and there has not been an honest, forthcoming truth and reconciliation process around the attempted genocide of Indigenous peoples in this country, that makes all of our work at the individual level and at the national level complicated when we are dealing with these legacies and the intergenerational impact in that gets labeled as culture for Jews. Oh, the Jews are just urgent, or Black people are just, don't respond quickly enough. Well, you know what? they're leveraging ancestrally proven best practices based upon the harms and traumas they have endured that have helped us survive generations. And so I would just add to what both Dr. Heschel said and also what Ms. Katz spoke about, that at a deeper level in this, what I start to get into with communities and with my clients is around actually looking at these histories through this lens and starting to see that the more we get intimate with each other's histories and the ways we have learned to survive in circumstances in which our peoples, in similar and in very different ways, which leads to some of that conflict and trauma hooks that happen, have been targeted for destruction. We have and continue to be, our peoples have and continue to be targeted for destruction. And so that is, to me, one of the parts of the heart of Black Jewish conflicts and challenges, is that we are trying to be, as we should be, as was spoken, mindful, and often the burden and the weight of these histories of unhealed harm are weighing heavy on our hearts and on our souls. And so,
heavy.
Right? And so the work that I do
Yeah.
with my colleagues and friends and in community and professionally is to integrate trauma-informed leadership around why at times we might not be able to stay calm, and what we do in those scenarios, like give ourselves a moment to slow down and find a way to gracefully take a break. This is like the formal stuff we teach in my trainings is slow down, buy yourselves time, honor what's been said, and find a dip out something has been said that is legitimately bringing up trauma. And response, right? And what we know, to add on to what Ms. Katz has already spoke about, psychology as well as neurology, is that how trigger and trauma works is in less than a second. When something is said that brings up our trauma, our body is already in a trauma response. And what I've seen play out in terms of public debacle, both private and public debacles around our sacred and important relationship, is that people are missing some key tools and insights that position them to heal, to recenter, to get the connection they need, and to come back to the intercultural dialogue ready to be as courageous and clear as they can be.
You make me take my glasses off. I think I have to ask. Because what you just shared is, in lieu of, sometimes what we do, April, is atrocity Olympics. Oh, this was worse. The Holocaust was worse than slavery. Slavery was worse than the Holocaust. And we kind of create barriers to us working together as Black and Jewish communities. And for you, that's your dual community. You're coming from both.
Yeah.
People. All of us are your people. All of us are all each other's people anyway. But we often have these atrocity Olympics where we try to compare what happened to each group instead of saying each group is dealing with a trauma. The atrocities were different. They were layered differently. But often, April, for Black people living in this country, having come here enslaved, didn't even come here as by choice. And having looked at for hundreds of years, lived through trauma after trauma on this land, it's often difficult when you feel like you have other groups who came here by primarily because even if they were fleeing certain situations, they still in their choosing for the most part came here. And then in this nation, it seems as though Black people are consistently oppressed in lending and environmental injustice and in different ways. Sometimes it seems as though the tension is, when will it be our turn for justice? When will it be time for Black people to get to the place where people are willing to fight as hard when somebody does something that wrongs the Black community for justice? How do we balance that with not playing into the plans of a millenniums long evil like white supremacy? How do we dig into it and dig into the tension and not act like it doesn't exist, but say, hey, Black folks are tired of feeling like we never get our issues addressed. And maybe that's some of the rage and the hurt that's coming out in these situations.
Yes, and it is valid. Thank you for this question. I love it so much. All right. What I want to do is, what I would say is dig deep. So you have two options with the first part of this is, so one, I would say something that I've learned as someone with mixed heritage, as someone who is the granddaughter of my grandma Emma, who was a minister in Turkey, North Carolina. I have family in Oklahoma, Mississippi. My Black family come from the deep South, have deep roots in this country. I also have indigenous heritage. I'm a member of a tribe, and I also have Jewish heritage, right? I'm a member of 3 different groups that have been targeted for destruction. And what I can say about that is, with the piece around when will it be our turn, it looks different, but all of those different groups and other groups actually have a similar question, are asking a similar question, right? Because part of how oppression operates is to make other groups think that other groups have it better, right? But what I've learned from my own experience of oppression, right? My dad being wrongfully beaten by the police, right? His job, his education, nothing protected him from that, right? As a Black man in this country. But that never made the news, right? I think what people don't miss, unless you take time to deeply study oppression, is that most oppression never makes the news. And so when other people hear it, they think that that group is getting more coverage than another group. So that's one thing. Now, layered on top of that, there's a lot of both and here, Dr. West. Now, layered on top of that is that white Ashkenazi Jews, and Jews in general, but specifically European heritage Jews, are positioned higher on the racial hierarchy within America right now. And that has all kinds of consequences, let alone the histories that you spoke about, where the nature of the oppression in America for Black folks has been far worse and more aggressive and more violent than it has for white Jews, right? And so what I would say is that I agree with you around oppression Olympics, right, or atrocity Olympics, as you say. And what I would say, earlier you spoke about a pattern that I would call minimization, right? When you mentioned Dr. King said that we shouldn't be a melting pot, right? That we should think of ourselves as a mosaic. And similarly, in a different, darker sense, what I would say is that I don't think it's helpful in simplistic terms to rate our oppression. What I would encourage, right? So that's on the surface. So I'm a very deep, introspective person, and I think a number of people on this call are. So I'm going to give you 2 options. One is just to stick with what you said and to not play into atrocity Olympics. And for those who, for you, and for those who are like, but what about some of these discrepancies? My invitation would be dig deeper. That actually the deeper we look, especially for the Black and Jewish community and our allies too, it actually is really horrific in each case, but it looks similar in some ways and also very different. So on its surface, right, in an American context in general, Black folks have clearly, unequivocally had it far worse than white Ashkenazi Jews, right? And when we put into global history and millennia of the murders and pogroms and the violence that has followed the Jewish community over thousands of years, we start to see a different perspective. But a lot of people don't about that, right? And also going back to what I talked about trauma patterns, I'm not going to talk too much on here, but I'm going to put this one here, is that also leads to embodied experiences of trauma or power or lack thereof very differently. And this leads to a trauma hook, what one of my teachers, Sherry Brown, talks about as a trauma hook, where we have 2 different people who are targeted by white supremacy, but the way we get targeted is very different. In
very different. Yeah.
Black folks, I describe it like this when I teach people. It's like a hammer, and it is constant. Black folks are placed at the bottom of the totem for what, and I think also our Native Americans, again, it plays out differently, but Black folks and indigenous people are placed at that bottom. One was targeted by multi-generational enslavement, and one was targeted for death for different reasons that served the purposes of white supremacist delusion, right? But for Jews, what happens is how anti-Semitism plays out is it's real peaceful and nice. And Jews are positioned as a middle agent in between the most oppressed and the hierarchy as a buffer. And it's real safe until it's not. And then it functions like an invisible guillotine and people die.
That's what's happened recently, April, what you're describing, because suddenly it was like, okay, bam, anti-Semitism. It's like, where's that?
And that's how it operates, right? And what that leads to is a lot of people thinking that Jews have it great, but what Jews have in their bones and in their family lineage is internalized terror. And so the trauma hook happens is because Black people, if everything I'm saying here is useful, not universal, just to be clear. I'm not saying all Black people, I'm speaking in some broad sociological strokes. So for Black folks, we encounter a friction with the Jewish community or situation in general where our communities are interacting, Black folks tend to slow down a little bit because we know wherever we go, we gonna be Black. So unless it's our lives are at stake, I mean, we joke about this in our families, right? Like that's why you don't see any Black ghost stories. There are very few ghost haunted house movies about Black folks. My dad used to say, "I'm in the breeze, movie over, credits." Like, there's no movie here. I hear a ghost say, "Get out, we out," right? Because that's something that's an ancestrally proven best practice for us. When there's danger, we move. But when it's about this oppression in general, we've learned how to have Black joy in this context. We've learned how to have resilience,
right.
Powerful resilience. And so when something's happening, we slow down because the system is rigged against us and we know we need to move slowly. Whereas Jews, because it's been peaceful and then all of a sudden it spikes, and over history, over millennia, then Jews either experience violence or die at times en masse. Jews have at times around urgency and frenetic energy, which when that's directed at Black people, we often, even I as a fellow Jew, can experience that as racism. And then when Black people back off and are like, no, I'm right, that's experienced as anti-Semitism because it isolates Jews. And that trauma, the oppression, lands on us differently and sets us up to continually be at odds, even when we are working to navigate the oppression itself.
Working to navigate. April, I just want to summarize what you've shared here before we bring Julie and Professor Heschel back on for our second to last segment. And then at the end of that segment too, the next segment, Dr. Bernice A. King will join us. But some of what you shared that I believe answers the question, why all the tension, is that we haven't paid attention to the histories of harm. That really resonates with me. And also, we don't understand the layers of oppression or the manifestations of oppression for different groups. So some of the tension is, well, we got it worse than you, or you have it worse than me, or they pay more attention to you. But if we really say we want to create the beloved community, and we recognize that both of these evils, anti-Black racism and hate and anti-Semitism, prevent us from doing that, we can work together. So that tension, sometimes it appears, based on what you're saying, comes from us not understanding, and as you said, this may be a dark approach, the interconnectedness of harm. How it may look like it's separate, but it's actually together. I just want to share those two things with the audience as we answer the question, why all the tension? All three of you have given me so much to think about and to consider, and I hope it's that way for the audience too. I want you to share, for those of you watching now, just one thing you want to. Somebody put your whole name on here, April Aviva Baskin. That's not your name, I don't think.
Yeah,
must be a friend. We have people sharing hearts, sharing their comments here. Share this broadcast. Share it right now with people. These are courageous conversations. You tune into the King Center. You hear us talking about the things that people are thinking about every day, but we're doing it in a way to be constructive, not to be destructive. And that's very important. We can talk this out. We can get through this tension, but we have to do it with the mindset of we're going to construct and build community and not destroy each other. That's all we're doing here. You can do that at home. You can do that in your workplace. You can do it in your faith groups, our churches, synagogues, mosques. We can do this everywhere. We can talk it out instead of letting tension overtake us. So we want to welcome Professor Heschel and Julie Katz back on to continue the conversation. Welcome back. I miss you. Yeah, I want to ask, as I've been asking as we come into the next segments, what are your thoughts about that last conversation with April?
April is fantastic, always. And I love what she said. I love to hear your conversation between the two of you. It was wonderful and very constructive, very helpful to us. But I also would say what Julie said earlier, Julie Katz, was also very helpful and thoughtful in how we approach one another. I certainly agree. I don't think that we should punish people for saying something offensive. We should try to change how they think and see if we can come together.
Yeah, that's often, we get so much pushback on that, Professor Heschel, even at the King Center. It's not my job to change people who harm me. But these are the choices we're facing, as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said. Our choice is either nonviolent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. We are facing a time now where if we don't learn to talk to each other, we are ushering in our extinction. And so when we talk about, okay, this isn't someone I feel like I should talk to because they hurt me in what they said, then we also have to say, okay, then if we don't talk it out, if we don't find a way to help people, even ourselves, because sometimes it's hard to say we all have biases. I mean, a lot of people don't want to admit that, but I'm like, I very often I find myself saying, I will not have these biases. I am going to get rid of every bias that prevents me from loving humanity fully. And that's something we each have to decide we're going to do. We all have things we've learned from authority figures. We've learned in different ways in our lives that we have to determine, I'm not going to live like that or think like that, as we consider our KHO theme, cultivating a beloved community mindset to transform unjust systems. Julie, do you have anything you want to share about that last segment?
Yeah, just that I appreciated all of it. And there's one phrase you used, April, that's really stuck with me, is when you were talking about using rigor and compassion to address these issues, because those words are very opposite. Rigor is kind of this like work, kind of fast-paced type of, that's the kind of feeling that it gives. And then compassion feels like this very patient, slow thing that we have to be doing and giving to other people. And I really appreciate how you put those two things together, because they actually have to go together to do the work that you are doing to help to make this world a better place and make people be able to live freely as they should.
Thank you for that, Julie. I want to drop this statement, this comment, as we begin to close out this conversation. And it's something that I think about often: the value of saying, I will not participate in harming any group of people. Just want to talk about that for a moment, why that's valuable in answering the question, why all the tension? Because it can sometimes be that if I feel like I've been harmed, or the group I most identify with has been harmed, I think it's okay to harm other groups. And often we have to consider, how do we work together and say individually, I will not participate in harming anyone or any group of people, but then also say that collectively, even when it appears to be in the best interest of a group or in my best interest, I will not participate. And that gets us to this question about collective accountability in allyship. How do we get there? And we often use this word that I think is sometimes I hear intersectionality and I think, let me dissect the word first and get to what it means. But I believe it simply means our problems, our issues aren't isolated. That if I approach someone and I happen to encounter a woman who is transgender and Black, then I have to realize that she's not only dealing with being transgender, she's also facing the fact that she's Black, right, April? She's getting a layered discrimination and injustice.
The woman.
So the question is, what do we do with that? How do we become allies in a way that I see what my Jewish neighbors are going through, and my Jewish neighbors see what Black people are encountering? Why is collective allyship, compassionate allyship, cooperation so important in facing this tension? And we'll start with you, Julie, if you want to start for us, and we'll just go around and share.
Oh boy. Okay. I was having my fingers crossed. I hope someone else goes first, so I have some more time to think about this.
It's you.
I'll happily take the first bat or whatever. I don't even know sports metaphors, but try my very best here. Sure. So how do we do collective allyship? So one thing I do want to acknowledge is that oftentimes the world feels very overwhelming, and there's a ton of oppression out there. There's a lot we have to face, and a lot of people want to be allies and help other communities and their friends, but get a little bit overwhelmed about where to start. So I think the messaging that we have to use is there's a lot going on. It's hard to know where to start, but take one step. So if you meet with a friend who tells you about an issue that is close to their community that they are struggling with, take that one step first. Ask them how you can really help. Sharing things on social media and spreading the message is helpful, but what's one way that you can dig a little bit deeper? And then from there, if there are other things that come to your attention that you feel like you can very meaningfully contribute to, not just share things on social media, which again is helpful in its own right, but what's something you can really do, then take that next step. And so help people break things down so it doesn't feel like the whole world is so overwhelming and they can't fix anything, because that's the messaging we have to use, is that we are all empowered. There's a beautiful quote by, is it Maimonides or Hillel? April or Susanna, tell me once I say the quote. It's, you are not free to complete the work, nor are you free to desist from it.
Hello.
Okay. I knew it had to be one of the two.
And for Cavo. Yeah.
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 So that's my take on it, is let's break it down in small steps and empower people that way.
Excellent. April, what are your thoughts?
Professional hers, but if you ask me, I will honor that, Dr. West. Okay, so what I would say,
I want to share too, let's remind everyone, April's in Senegal, so there's a lag there. Sometimes she's a little behind, but it's okay. We've had a powerful conversation, so we've heard everything she said. Made me take my glasses off, but April, go ahead. Thank you.
Oh, when you said it reminds me of my grandma would say, I nearly fell out laughing. So, okay, I would concisely, you're reminding me also to speak mindfully, which I think can help with the lag. So I can choose my words more carefully. There's a 3-point piece I would say as concisely as possible. On this piece of accountability, a distinction that I've started to make with different people through my work is that accountability, for a lot of people, I think it reminds them of our carceral culture and feels like punishment and shaming. And I invite people to think about accountability as commitment. How are we committed to one another? And so as we think about the question you asked around how can we help, is to continually focus on how can we deepen our commitment, which I think I'm just adding to what Julie already said here, but specifically is really encourage ourselves to think about to whom we are accountable, meaning to whom are we committed, and steadily increase that circle. The second point to me that I would invite people to, and this will resonate some of that for others, but it's critical for all of us, I would contend, is to take the time in the ways and the spaces you need to continue ongoing healing. Dr. Heschel spoke about a reservoir. In my work at Joyous Justice, we speak about a well, quite similar. That we have our emotional cup. There's also a wellness cup we want to overflow. We also have an emotional cup that gets full, and at times when our trauma gets triggered, it starts pouring in from that well or reservoir. And what we can do at times is make time, when we take time to slow down and pause, to reach for people in our own community first, and to put on our oxygen mask and take time to cry or shake or process what is coming up, to clear the decks so that we can show up with greater clarity when we show up in conflict and challenge, and have that space that Julie was just speaking about, to ask brave questions and have the bandwidth to receive it. And the last piece I would say is to encourage people to believe in the beauty of the bonds you have. That the way oppression operates is to make us think as Jews, as Black folks, as Black Jews, that when conflict arises, that relationship wasn't true. And that's not the case. That relationship, that connection is true, but so are our histories of harm. And when we take time to heal, we can have the opportunity to build from strength to strength with our existing connections that then embolden us to be braver and continue to widen our circles. That we don't, it's good for us to reach for strangers and to show up in new spaces, but also one of the best things we can do is to keep our existing connections and deepen them through the difficult times by supporting ourselves first and resourcing ourselves so we're equipped to better support and hold space for each other.
Thank you. Thank you, April. Thank you, Julie. Appreciate what you've shared. Again, I'm learning a lot. I'm telling you, they bring me in to moderate, and I'm just like, what can I take my notes? Professor Heschel.
Well, thank you. What can I add? I suppose I might come back to Saidiya Hartman's point that we're living in the future created by the past, and say that we also have to remember that we are right now creating the future that is to come. And so,
Mhm.
what kind of future do we want to have? And that's part of what's important about the Bible and the prophets, because the prophets are people who dream. And there's a really interesting link between dreaming and praying. And I think about that. We should not lose the ability to dream. And uh, yeah, it's part of hope. And it's part of also affirming ourselves and affirming that we have hope, we have desires for the future that we want to create. So the prophets dream of an era in which there will be world peace, peace among human beings, and peace even among animals, peace in nature itself. So I think right now what we need to do when sometimes, and I'm certainly one of the people who can get really mad in moments and really upset, I have to calm myself and reassure myself and say, now look, what do I want to make of this moment that will be creating the future, a better future, the kind of future that I dream of. And and then finally, I just have to say there's this amazing passage in the Bible where God says, you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. Now, who commands love? You command someone to love you? What does that mean?
Hmm.
And there's a Jewish thinker, Franz Rosenzweig, who said, well, the only person who demands your love is a person who loves you. When you love someone, you want them to love you back, of course, because love is a relationship and it needs to be reciprocal. And so perhaps we need to remember that aspect too. We want to be loved, we have to give love. And then finally, I just have to say that it seems to me that there's a lot of resentment in the air these days, all around the
Mhm.
world. Resentment and anger. It's not something I fully understand, but I think we need to worry about that and wonder how we can remove the resentment, because resentment is like an iron wall and it doesn't allow us to love and form relationships and be in alliance. So that I would say is a blockage that we need to get rid of so that we can have the reciprocity and the allyship that will create the future that we're in the process of creating every moment.
Wow. Thank you so much. I want to, as I prepare to bring on Dr. Bernice A. King, share these words from her mother talking about her father that I believe summarize what the three of you, our great guests for this Beloved Community Talks experience, just shared. And Mrs. King says about Dr. King, he understood that multicultural unity was not only a way we can live together, but also a very powerful tool for personal, social, economic, and political empowerment. He understood that equal rights can be legislated to a great extent, but genuine brotherhood and sisterhood cannot, for it comes from the heart. We have learned that there's nothing automatic about good race relations. Instead, we must consciously work to build interracial trust and cooperation. If we are serious about fulfilling Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream of a nation united in justice and peace, somehow, some way, we have to find a way to live together. As Martin said, like life, racial understanding is not something that we can find, but something that we must create. The ability to work together to understand each other will not be found ready made. It must be created by the fact of contact. Powerful words, definitely caused me to ponder all that you shared in this conversation. Certainly, us understanding that we have to address any tension between any communities. start to know each other. As Dr. King said, the ability to work together and understand each other will not be found ready-made. It must be created by the fact of contact. That's why we're having this conversation. And we're grateful that you each joined us in asking the question and providing some answers to galvanize us into the work. Dr. Bernice A. King is the CEO of the King Center. She's a global leader, a renowned orator, and just, I believe, doing a tremendous job of lifting and carrying the legacy of not one global leader, but two. I always think about it and I think, you don't have one parent that's a global leader renowned around the world. You have two. And in addition to that, building great initiatives at the King Center, such as this conversation, these beloved community talks. Please welcome everyone, Dr. Bernice A. King. Welcome. Welcome to your own broadcast, Dr. King. You're muted. You're muted. Yep. There you go.
Now I'm not.
Now you're not. Welcome.
Yes. Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here on tonight. And I'm, I've never quite heard it put like you just said it. So I'm kind of humbled when you said not just one, but two, because I've never truly thought about that. So that's something to ponder. But look, I'm, tonight, in spite of everything you said about me, I'm grateful. I'm grateful to you, Julie, and April, and my good friend, Susanna. Good to see you again and to be with you for this conversation, needed conversation. In a time where so many people are searching for real solutions and a way out of the chaos and the polarization so that we really can address the things that are seeking to overtake us. Some things, as April has pointed out, the targets that are at all of these different communities. We really need the strength and ability to really focus on that. And everything that was discussed tonight is, to me, is a prescription. It's maybe it's a hard pill to swallow for some people, but it's necessary for us to really not only strengthen these relationships, but strengthen the relationships of humanity, so that what threatens all of us can adequately be addressed. And so I want to thank you all. We wanted to have the beginning of this kind of conversation because so often we're just at each other's heads. And unfortunately, our news industry likes to fan the flames. And sometimes, obviously, the new form of news, social media, adds even more fuel to the fire. And so we need conversations like tonight to happen more often. And we need the spaces that people can feel comfortable enough to share some of these truths. As April said, we haven't had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Truth, Healing, and Reconciliation in this nation. It's desperately needed. I remember, and I won't get into calling a lot of names, but I remember my mother was working so heavily on that during her lifetime with some of our previous presidential administrations, and she was not successful. But it is important that something like that happens in this country. And I really so appreciate the conversation as it built, around the harm, the trauma, the intersectionality, because so often we are so caught up in the harm, in the hurt, in the pain, and doing our best from different perspectives to respond out of it or react out of it, that we haven't slowed down enough to really deal with it. And that is a sin in and of itself in this nation, that we have allowed ourselves not to address the trauma in this nation. And we've got to do that. We've got to find ways, because we're building, every time something else happens, it just builds on and builds on. So yes, Susanna, we have to have this dream of what that future is like. And I thought about, as you were talking, in the Bible, when it talks about where there is no vision, the people perish.
Yes.
In one version, it says they cast off restraint. And it seems like that's where we are, because there has not been a rally and vision in this nation
Yes.
That has been shared. And that's why we continue to press into this beloved community, because I want this country and world to get it. Dr. King gave the vision of the dream, but he was talking about the beloved community ultimately. And we've got to get people to begin to have a vision so that we can begin to work toward this just, humane, equitable, peaceful, and sustainable world. And to close with Daddy's words, because you mentioned him several times tonight, Mother, that quote Mother I spoke about from Daddy, I've used it several times in the past about, saying it, I'm losing it now.
Like life, racial understanding.
Yes, like life, racial understanding is not something, that you find. It's created by the fact of contact.
Yes.
But he also said we must learn to live together as brothers and sisters, or together we will be forced to perish as fools. And so tonight, this is really that process. What we've been talking about is that learning process, because we have to find a way to coexist. We're family. And yes, Dr. West, I struggle, April, Susanna, and Julie, I struggle with the word ally, only because every time I hear it, all I hear is, how can I help you with your problem? And I'm like, my problem, this is your problem too. This is our problem. How are we going to help ourselves with what's happening to us that's deteriorating our culture? It's deteriorating our environments. I mean, we all have to get involved to address these things that are affecting people and right some of these wrongs going forward. So it's good to have these conversations, and I appreciate it, and we're going to continue to do that, but we also have to do that work. And that saying that says people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. That caring really meets the road when something is harming and affecting me, and you stand up with me, for me, alongside of me, and address that very thing. So that's where we've got to get to in this nation. And I think, this was a necessary conversation. And I know that there are those of us in the Black community, we've been sitting on some of our feelings around everything. So we wanted to have this conversation as a beginning.
Thank you, Dr. King.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us on this journey.
On this journey, in the middle of the holidays. Happy Hanukkah.
Yes, happy Hanukkah.
Christmas, happy
April and
Kwanzaa.
Susanna and Julie, yes.
Yes, to all
on
of
our way
us.
to Kwanzaa. Merry Christmas to others.
Merry Christmas. Thank you.
It's
this is
with you.
Thank you, Professor Heschel. This is has been such a rich conversation. I'm so grateful to have been in this space and have had it with each of you. Thank you, Professor Heschel. Thank you, April. Thank you, Julie. We just want to, say blessings to you on your continued work. Each of you are doing something that's so critical to creating the beloved community. We want to invite each of you to be a part of, share about our upcoming King Holiday events, and I'll share more about those at the end of our broadcast. But we have a summit that's a part of the King Holiday where we will continue these types of conversations in 7 to 8 panels. We continue to talk about cultivating a beloved community mindset. to transform unjust systems. It's a continual conversation, but as Dr. King pointed out, the work continues too. And so one of the things we'll do with that summit is have think tanks and also have projects that people who participate in the summit work on to conquer some form of injustice in this nation or across the globe. So we want to continue to hear you and see you and have you be a part of the King Center community, all three of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you.
Conversation.
Good to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Bye. Dr. King. Wow.
Dr. West.
I'm saying. I mean,
Whew.
I just, yeah. Powerful insight from each one of our guests for this conversation. And I know we want to be sure we leave the audience with some nuggets that we can carry and really start to apply. What are those things as you consider what our guests shared and you talk about the trauma? Perhaps it's good that the audience that's listening to this broadcast know that each of us has some trauma we need to address, and trauma
Yes.
contributes to tension. And so
Yes,
as we close, let's talk about briefly the impact of trauma and how it prevents us from living and creating the beloved community together. When you think about that, when you consider what April shared and Julie and Professor Heschel, what are our next steps? What do you think we can do, particularly as we move into our King holiday observance? Because they're gonna try to celebrate your daddy. They're gonna plant some trees, do some murals, which is important. We have to take care of our communities. But when you consider what we shared here tonight, how important is it that we join those service projects with some work to address this trauma and to transform unjust systems?
Well, the first thing before we even get to that, I think it's important for people to spend a little time with themselves, identifying the traumas. It's different for different ones of us. I have a lot, personally, you can look at it from a personal perspective. In my case, with my daddy's assassination, my uncle being found in swimming pool, my grandmother being shot in church, to the separation between me and my mom, because once my father was assassinated, all of that, she began to carry forth, the work that she did. So she wasn't at home as much, and the separation that it brought and how it traumatized me as a 5-year-old. That's the personal. Then there's cultural trauma. So I think people need to just unpack that, because some people are not aware. I mean, we're talking about it more now, but we're just kind of living, and these things happen, and we go, and we respond to whatever emotion comes up, or react, but we never sit with ourselves to say, okay, let me list out my own traumas, and then thinking about what is a potential treatment protocol for those traumas. It's different for different people. Everybody can't afford counseling.
Right.
But there may be some things that don't cost. There may be some safe spaces with people. There may be some practices from a meditative standpoint. They're just some some of those breathing things. There just may be creating your own system of saying, okay, I now know my traumas. Also, I forgot, as you know your traumas, know your triggers. Because all of this is important. Because if we're caught up in the trauma and the things that trigger it, we get stuck in that, and we never can get to the space and place where we get to the bottom of what's happening to our society that's affecting all of us. These injustices, how the system of white supremacy, what that was set in order, that kind of is just continuing to perpetuate itself. We don't have it. We need to address it, because you can't address it from a space of hostility or anger or rage, or unresolved harm. adequately. So I think those things are necessary. But yes, then as you do that, because you don't want to be in a siloed place, the connections that, like she said, is not ready-made, comes from the fact of contact,
Mm-hmm.
understanding. We've got, we let's stop doing what's familiar and comfortable. You know, find some spaces and places of service and outreach that you haven't been in. I'm comfortable going dealing with the unsheltered. You know what I'm saying? But there may be some other places that you've never been in so that you can begin to open yourself a little bit more because you know this is a mosaic. Our humanity, it's a wonderful mosaic, and we haven't even, you know, experienced the most of it. A lot of us, we have a very narrow world. So I think that's some of the things that we need to do. And then we encourage, you and I talked about this, encourage people to have these, you know, courageous conversations. You know, we're doing that. You can go and
Very
use some of
important.
our toolbox, you know, to do some of that, so that you know, some of the boundaries. This is, you know, the key thing that kept surfacing tonight was about, you know, understanding, not just from
Yes.
understanding each other, but understanding these harms and how, you know, these harms have impacted different people and the layers of the harm. Because if we don't have the understanding, then how are we going to adequately create any kind of cure remedy, for the situation?
Mm-hmm.
So I think all of that is so important. But more importantly, we're gonna have part two of this as we delve, because this is not the end of it, certainly, and it's not a one-time conversation, because we want people to actualize. You know, these conversations are not designed just to stay in the theoretical mode. We want to add some
Right.
praxis and practice to this, and some work to this, and some showing up in spaces. Because yes, it is true, you know, that oftentimes, and I'm just speaking from the community that I come from, that you come from, it is true that when things happen to us in the Black community, it just it whittles away. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
get the same energy and attention and focus and desire to see it corrected, as it should. That's the inequity in addressing, you know, racism. Everything else gets its due, but racism, anti-Black racism in particular, doesn't get that. And we need that. And we have to stop just counseling people. I have to bring that up before we close, Dr. West. I don't like this cancel culture. Yes, I said it tonight on our BCT. I don't like it. It's counterproductive. Now, if the trauma in your life is so great, you may have to separate yourself for a season. But the spirit of cancellation is what I'm talking about, not the
Mm-hmm.
need for protecting oneself, but the spirit of
Mm-hmm.
to those people, that group, or whatever, to the point that you really you're in a subconscious way practicing what white supremacy is, which is now grouping those people in an inferior way. You know, they're not worth even paying attention to. They're not people. You know, they're whatever I label them
Yeah.
as. So yeah.
But you know, Dr. King, everything you just shared connects to that beloved community mindset. The idea that as we talk about, there are some things I have to unlearn, some patterns that I've embraced that I need to get rid of.
Yes.
And then when I do that, I can do some of the work, like what Julie mentioned about having the very courageous conversations about Kyrie Irving and about
Yes.
anti-Semitism and racism, to venture into those spaces where I might be a little uncomfortable, but I need to do it anyway. Those are the things that, as I think about, even the theme for KHO, we have to do if we're going to create the beloved community. We can't get around people. If we cancel everybody who disagrees with us, then nobody
Right.
will be left standing. It'll just be us. It'll just be me
Yeah.
by myself, because
Yeah.
I'm always going to have some contention. It's what we do with that tension that I really
Exactly.
believe as human beings, it matters, because tension is not the bad thing. It's what we do with it and how
Who
we
is it?
respond to it. So I think we take from this conversation that we have an individual and collective work to do. So we want to invite everybody who was listening to Dr. King and Julie Katz and Professor Susanna Heschel and April Baskin to ask yourself the question, one question first. What trauma or what have I experienced that contributes to any tension that I'm encountering in relationships, specifically in this conversation, relationships between Black and Jewish people, Black and Jewish communities. And there are other questions we can ask, and then we can start to apply for us at the King Center a way of thinking, a philosophy that helps us dissect even our emotions and determine a path forward. We have to commit to this. I want to, as we close, I received a message that we have a definition for Afro-pessimism, which is something that Professor Heschel mentioned. We want to share that with you as we close today. A lens of interpretation that accounts for the civil society's dependence on anti-Black violence. I'm going to have that come across again. Dr. King, I want to share, as we end tonight's broadcast, this is one of the last things your mom said in that speech, 1994. We can create that beloved community that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. envisioned. Let us now dare to embrace this common vision and mobilize all of our resources to bring it into being. She didn't even say some of our resources, King. She said mobilize all of them. Let us build a society based on hope, and let us not only dream, but create a new national unity, unburdened by the bigotry and strengthened by conscious commitment to prosperity through interracial brother and sisterhood. Martin Luther King Jr.'s words provide an urgent challenge to all of us to become peacemakers. We challenge you today to become peacemakers. And I hope you will become a drum major in those areas of lasting value. Be a drum major for human rights. Be a drum major for love. Be a drum major for justice. Be a drum major for peace. Be a drum major for the beloved community with all of your heart and soul. And you can be that servant. She ended with, thank you and God bless you. That's the words from Coretta Scott King, 1994. A message you can find on YouTube, Infinite MIT. It was the 20th annual Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. celebration. We want to close with those words tonight and invite you to be a part of the King Center's King Holiday Observance 2023. You'll find a list of events on the King Center website. Our press conference, our Nonviolence 365 training, which will happen actually this year by way of a training on biases, how to unpack and unlearn biases, which will be on Monday, January 9th and 10th, not Friday, January 6th and 7th. Those bias workshops you see there as well. That Nonviolence 365 training will not happen. We will roll part of that into those Unlearning Biases workshops. We have a children's book reading, a Beloved Community Global Summit, January 12th and 13th. I mentioned that earlier. A teach-in.
And wait a minute, Dr. West, I want to
ahead.
make sure they heard that. We want you to really join us for this summit.
Absolutely.
It's very necessary. A lot of times we participate in the ceremonial things, but and I'm not saying that the ceremony doesn't have substance in it, but this is where we get down to the nitty-gritty of
Down
things.
to it. Much like this
Helping us
conversation.
to address cultivating those beloved community mindsets. So go ahead. You were saying the book,
children's book reading, the summit. We have a teach-in where you'll get some materials from our website on how to share about various
that's
topics.
for school systems. That's for school systems and educators.
Yes.
That they can go and sign
Beloved
up
Community
for
Awards and Afterglow. This year, the King Center is honoring at the Beloved Community Awards Dolly Parton for her work, Ariel Investments, Holly Robinson and Rodney Peake with their Holly Rod Foundation. We're also honoring Patagonia. Yes, Yvonne Chenard, the founder, owner of Patagonia. And this group of young people. Let me be sure I get their name right. I'm gonna look it up. Be sure I don't mess it up. We also have the commemorative service where Brian Stevenson will be our speaker for the commemorative service. So we have
who's singing? No, she's
who's
joking.
singing? Stephanie Mills.
No, Stephanie Mills is for the afterglow. With
Afterglow.
the community award.
Yeah, who's singing at the
commemorative is Kiki Sheard, Yolanda Adams, Justin Schultz, a young man who does the voice box, and just
are you
really
singing?
talented gentleman. I'm singing. Yeah, I'm gonna sing.
Okay. All right, y'all write that down. Be sure your ad is in person at Historic Ebenezer.
Yes, and we're back in person. Please make that clear. We're back in person for the Beloved Community Awards. We're back in person at Ebenezer for the commemorative, and some of the Beloved Communities Summit. The beginning session with me will be at the King Center Theater for Yolanda D. King Theater for the Performing Arts. I'll be in person there to open up the Beloved Community Summit at the King Center if you want to come. And the closing session on Friday, will be hybrid as well. The 13th.
13th, yes.
Ooh, Friday 13th. We're closing out on
the
Friday
good day 13th. To be at a
That's
Beloved
Community. Yes, we're closing out at the King Center in person too, but all the rest of the summit will be just virtual. It'll be a hybrid the entire time, not the entire time, the opening session and the closing session, but then it will be virtual the rest of the time.
Thank you. I want to get their name right, Dr. King. The name of this group of young people who, when they were faced with injustice in their school system, came up with a plan for how to address it, implemented that plan, and witnessed change in their school system. That's the Panther Anti-Racist Union. It's a group of young people that
they got those books. They tried to ban books in their school, and they were able to stop it.
So they're being honored with the Beloved Community Youth Influencer Award on Saturday, January 14th. And if you want to join us for that, you can find out more about that and purchase tickets. I want to highlight something that's not often highlighted, and we want to start to say more. This is the King Center's annual fundraiser. So I want to also share with everyone watching that these events, these experiences don't just happen, that this great work needs funding. And I want to invite you to donate, to go to thekingcenter.org and donate to the King Center's work. The continual work of creating the beloved community by way of advocacy, education, and training with Nonviolence 365. We have a Nonviolence 365 online course that's phenomenal. You can find it at thekingcenterinstitute.org. But and you can support
it's self-paced.
Self-paced.
Yeah, it's a self-paced course.
Mm-hmm.
You can take your time going through it, and it's very powerful.
Yes.
It's now in 6 languages.
Yes.
So Russian, I'm sorry, not Russian yet. Needs to be. Spanish, French, Italian, Korean, Mandarin, and German.
Excellent.
Yes. I just want people to know that since they're listening, perhaps from all over the world.
Yeah. If you anybody ever ask you, what does the King Center do? We want you to be able to tell them that we reach the world with nonviolence. Our goal is to create the beloved community. We believe nonviolence is the way to make that happen. This conversation has been a part of that work, because if you notice how we had this conversation, it was very much aligned with the principles and steps of nonviolence. And we just want to encourage you, study with us, grow with us, be a part of the King Center community. Share this broadcast using the hashtags Beloved Community Talks, BCT, and Courageous Conversations. Thank you, Dr. King. Thank you, Julie Katz. Thank you, April Baskins. Thank you, Professor Heschel. It's been my honor to moderate this conversation, and we'll see you next time.